Greetings, my friends, and welcome back to Mastering the edTPA. Today's video is about the big idea of Task 1. And by the end of the video, you're not only going to understand the structures of Task 1, but you're going to understand the purpose, the big idea, the central point. Why are we doing this? And if you understand that, everything else becomes much, much easier. So let's begin. Your work on Task 1 begins by selecting a central focus. The central focus is analogous to, say, a unit goal. It's the big idea or the focal point of the lessons that you are going to teach. So, for example, if you were to collect 4 different lesson plans in a row and use that for your edTPA, there's some sort of connecting tissue, some sort of big idea that all 4 lesson plans or learning segments are trying to get to. It might be about fractions. It might be about playing a major scale. It might be about, I don't know, anything in your endorsement. But the point I want you to get here is that the planning of Task 1 is the same. It begins with the same elements that you would use for planning any unit. What is the big understanding, the central focus of our work? What do we want students to know or understand or be able to do by the end of these learning segments? You should be planning that way. This is backwards design. And the edTPA is structured around this as well. So it's not separate from your regular planning activities. The same process you go through in your mind is what you will begin when you're planning for your classes. It's the same thing you will do when you're planning for the edTPA. Once you have identified a central focus, and I should add, we're going to be looking at examples of central focus language later on when we actually look at documentation. Once you have identified the central focus, you're going to break it up into discrete learning segments. The edTPA allows you to have 3 to 5 learning segments. Each learning segment will have a lesson plan attached to it, and generally speaking, a learning segment corresponds with, that day's teaching. So if you're doing secondary math, for example, Monday's first period class is learning segment 1, Tuesday's first period class is learning segment 2, etc. If you're in an elementary setting, the math lessons you do from 10 o'clock to 11:30 on Monday would be segment 1. Tuesday would be segment 2. Generally speaking, it's whatever happens in that one class day or class period is the focus of each learning segment. So once you have a central focus, you'll divide it up into 3 to 5 learning segments. And I've chosen 4 here simply for demonstration purposes. 3 is perfectly acceptable. 5 is perfectly acceptable, so is 4. There's no added benefit to doing more or less as long as you have at least 3. And so just as you would when you were planning, you would have your big idea, the central focus, and you'd break it up into smaller pieces. If students are going to be able to do task X, how do I break that down into smaller pieces? What would we do on the first day? What would we do on the second day? Again, you're already planning this way, and the edTPA takes that into account. Each learning segment is going to account for what is the learning target for that day, spelled out in the students will be able to language. You'll list the assessments that you're going to use. You'll identify whatever instructional materials you might use for that day. And you will write a lesson plan that actually goes through kind of a play-by-play. Here's how I would teach this. The notes in Task 1 say that you should write it detailed enough that a substitute could come in and use your plans. And you'll do the same thing for each one of the learning segments. So far, this should be super, super, super familiar because this is the work you're already doing when you plan lessons. Okay, at least I hope it is. This is a really important thing. When you do this, you will be designing this with your specific students in mind. So when you create a learning segment, it can't be one for a hypothetical group of students somewhere. It has to be for your students in your room that you are in charge of. The learning target has to be appropriate for them. The assessments that you plan to use need to be constructed and crafted with those students in your classroom in mind. The instructional materials have to be appropriate for your students, not for some students somewhere, but for your students. And I'm emphasizing this point because people have missed this in the past, and they've written this as if it were another theoretical, abstract exercise for an instructional design class. This is anything but that. This is actual planning for actual lessons for actual students. But so far, all of this is things that you're already doing anyways. You're already thinking this way. You're already breaking a central focus down into smaller learning segments. You're already writing learning targets. You're already coming up with assessments and developing instructional materials, or using the curriculum materials that you're obligated to use. That's already happening. What makes task one different from just the regular teaching you're doing is that you're going to be documenting this and justifying, why did I do what I did? Because you're designing this with your students in mind, you have to explain, so what is it about my students that led me to make or to plan for these instructional decisions? Let's talk a little bit more about that. You're going to be documenting task one. So for example, all of this together, this whole thing here, you're going to capture in the lesson plans. The lesson plans will have your central focus. They will have the learning target, the assessments, and instructional materials for each day. Each learning segment will be documented by a lesson plan, and it will correspond numerically. So lesson plan 1 is learning segment 1, and lesson plan 2 is learning segment 2. You're given 4 pages for each lesson plan. And we have a Northwest University lesson plan template that has been provided to you, and it's aligned with the edTPA. If you actually do the things that are on the NU lesson plan template, you are accounting for all the things that the edTPA requires you to account for in the lesson plan. And once you've written all these lesson plans, which you're already doing anyways, you will put them all together into one document, make sure they're clearly labeled lesson plan 1, 4 pages later, lesson plan 2, 4 pages later, lesson plan 3, and you will put them all in one document, and you will submit that one document as part of your edTPA. But again, like any other lesson plans, it'll have the central focus and then the daily breakdown of that focus. So what's today's learning target that's going to get us closer to our unit goal? What are today's assessments? What are today's materials? And then the kind of play-by-play description of what we will actually do, the activities. You're also going to be documenting separately from that the actual assessments. So that while the lesson plan will describe the assessments, you are going to provide examples of the actual assessments. For example, if you say, we will be taking a short quiz as one of your assessments, you will provide a copy of that quiz. But this is very important. In task 1, you're planning. These are things you're going to do. So these will be blank examples. There'll be the quiz that nobody's written on. You're not yet providing examples of students completing the quiz. That comes later on in task 3. For now, you're going to provide examples of the assessments you're going to use. If you say that students are going to use an exit ticket, you're going to provide a copy of that exit ticket. If you say that students are going to have a discussion and you'll be listening in, you're going to provide a copy of the discussion questions that you're going to ask them to talk about. You will assemble all of these assessments and you'll label them clearly: lesson plan 1, assessment 1, lesson plan 2, assessment 2, etc. You'll assemble them all into one document. And there is no page limit for the assessments. So you could assemble as many as you need to until you have, well, like I said, no page limit for the assessments. So you'll have lesson plans that will document the central focus, the learning target. They will describe the assessments, describe the instructional materials, and describe the learning activities. And then in a separate document, you will assemble copies of the actual assessments you plan to use into a document and, name them clearly, label them clearly, and then upload those. So far there's two different kinds of files. There's the lesson plan files, and there are the assessment. Let's see what else there is. You're also going to provide an example of what the edTPA calls key instructional materials. So for example, if you have a handout that students are going to use as part of their learning, or a vocabulary sheet that they can refer back to, or if you have a map they're going to look at that's, you know, key part of the lesson, you'll provide examples of those. You've described them a little bit and talked about them in the lesson plans, but you will actually provide examples. And as always, you'll label them very clearly. Lesson plan 1, instructional material 1, lesson plan 2, instructional material 2, etc. And you can submit up to 5 pages for each learning segment. So, for example, if you had 3 learning segments, you could have up to 15 pages of instructional materials. If you have 5 learning segments, you could have up to 25 pages of instructional materials. But like always, you will assemble them all into one document to upload them. These instructional materials could be things that you developed yourself. They could be, it could be if there's a PowerPoint you are showing, you could have a picture of a screenshot of a slide, or you could have where you break down like 5 or 6 slides on the one page. If you could have screenshots of things on the computer, if there is a, let's say a word wall, many elementary teachers use word walls. If there's a word wall, you could take a picture of that word wall and upload that and put it in a Word document, and there you go. Anything and everything that you decide is a key instructional material, you can use. Now, you might say, well, some of my instructional materials are also assessments. First off, good, right? But secondly, if that's the case, you get to decide, where do I want to put it? Do I want to put that as an instructional material, or do I want to put it as an assessment? There's not a right answer to that. You get to make a choice. Remember that the most important resource here is your brain. So you will have used the lesson plans and the assessments and the key instructional materials to document the things about your lesson. Here are the things I'm going to do. But you also have to document things about your students, because, as I've said, these are not plans for abstract students, they're plans for your specific students. So, in addition to all of the documentation of your plans, you also have to document the demographics and sort of backgrounds of your class. There is a form called the Context for Learning form. It is a template provided by Pearson, and you have to complete it. It asks you to provide demographic information about your class, number of males, number of females, suburban or urban, what age groups are present. It gives you a chance to describe any interesting features about your classroom, such as I'm in a portable, or I'm in this kind of room and we have these kinds of resources in the room. And then finally, it gives you a chance to write about any students you have that have special needs. This would include students with IEPs or 504s, or it could be students who have language needs, ELL students, or other undefined or perhaps quote-unquote unofficial needs, but that are still very real in the class. We'll talk more about that later on when we actually look at the Context for Learning document. But there is a document provided by Pearson, a template provided by Pearson, and you fill out the questions and answer those. You don't have to think, what do I want to talk about? They tell you what they want you to talk about, and you will turn that in. So this is the 4th type of document we've talked about. We have the lesson plans, we have the key instructional materials, we have the assessments, and now we have the Context for Learning form, which tells about your students. All right, to review. We have 3 types of documents that talk about your plans. We have 1 document, the Context for Learning, that talks about your students. The last document we're going to talk about is about those 2 in combination. Here's what is true about my students, and here are the plans I made. How do these fit together? Why did you make these specific plans for these specific students? And this is where the Task 1 planning commentary comes into play. Through a series of prompts, They are going to force you to reflect on the connection between your students, their specific needs, their specific background knowledge, etc., and the plans that you have made. Why do these things go together? Why are these the right plans for these students? The Task 1 plan and commentary will be filled out in a template provided by Pearson, and you're just able to type into it. We will be looking at that in depth in a future video. And you have up to 11 pages to answer all of these prompts. So let's do a quick review. You have a context for learning document, which is demographic information about your students. It's just background about what we know about them. You'll have the lesson plans, which are detailed descriptions of the central focus, which is consistent across all 4 lesson plans, the learning targets, which will be specific to each lesson plan, and then your planned instruction and assessment, including what are the activities we're going to do, what materials am I going to use, how am I going to assess student progress. You will then provide examples of the actual instruction materials that you plan to use. You will provide examples of the blank copies of the assessments that you plan to use. And finally, you have the planning commentary, which is your explanation of why all of this constitute the right plans for these specific students. I hope this makes sense. And if it doesn't, don't worry, because in the next video, we're going to begin looking at each one of these documents specifically. We're going to start with the context for learning, which is our next video, and we're going to pull up the document and look at it page by page and walk through what it's asking for so that you will be equipped to do that. And as soon as you understand it, you can do the context for learning, fill it out at any time, and just get it off of your plate. I hope this was helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time.